We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to the Sports History Network Showcase, our in-house show featuring SHN podcasters talking sports, talking history, and talking sports history. My name is Oz Davis, host of the Sports History Network's Truly the Goats podcast. In this episode, my guest is Aron Harris of the website of the podcast, The Football Odyssey. Aron, how's it going for you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Great. I'm loving your podcast. I'm going through some of the older episodes lately. But before we get into that, let's talk about this. How long have you been a fan? How'd you get into football?
I got into football back in 2005, and I had never been a sports fan until that point. My father had tried to get me to watch some football. I just wanted nothing to do with it, though. And we were at a wedding visiting family down in West Palm Beach, and that was the same weekend that Pittsburgh was playing the Indianapolis Colts in the divisional round of the 2005 playoffs. And they were huge underdogs, but they were winning the game, and they were about to increase their lead. And Jerome Bettis fumbled the ball at the 1-yard line, and Ben Roethlisberger saved Bettis' career essentially by tackling. I think it was Nick Harper. I think Nick Harper was one that was returning, and he tackled them. And Mike Vanderjagt missed the field goal, and just the energy that it was, the camaraderie, everybody was watching the TV, and it was a fun game. And I had a neighbor who I had gone to school with who had moved right next door to me, who was a big football fan. He had played in the youth league, and some of his friends were also involved, and they would go over and a lot of time doing that as well. And then eventually I went to play football, really got deep into the X's and O's and the coaching side, strategy. And then, you just kind of go down a rabbit hole when you start getting into the history of the game with all the vintage books that you can read and learning about how many people have come before the game before you really got into it. So I just grew to have a passion for that, and through NFL films too. So a lot of different ways to look at the game, and that's what I love about it.
Yeah, I usually ask the podcasters that come on the showcase, how'd you get into the history of the sport? But I guess you came to the history at the same time you came to the game.
In some ways, I think I've always had a passion. I guess I would consider myself an old soul. I like things come before my time. I'm a big fan of, Turner Classic Movies. I love old music. So naturally, whenever I found a way to watch old games, I definitely bought into it. NFL Network back in my high school days were a little more flexible in their programming. So they would show a lot of NFL follies, old NFL films. They would just have old games. They would have like The Drive or, early Super Bowls beyond my years. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then there was a period of time where I didn't pay too much attention to that stuff. But then I read a book back in 2018 called The League by David Harris. And it wasn't a book that it's not your conventional football book. It's in a way similar to Michael McCambridge's America's Game, but it examines it from the perspective purely of the ownership circle of the NFL. So it really kind of looks at how Pete Rozelle kind of cultivated this league think mentality, and essentially how all the owners had kind of bought in at certain points and other times didn't really respect the idea and the amount of internal lawsuits that were being filed against one another. And eventually it culminates in the Raiders moving to Los Angeles and kind of breaking down that idea that made the league so uniform and so great. And that just the in-depth reporting of that book and how I kind of felt like I was there as a third observer, as like an outsider observing everything that was happening. And I think that was just something that really kickstarted my imagination for looking at football in every direction, but also in the history for how it was able to document 20 years of the league's history. And I just continued to go deeper, in the eras before that and different leagues and specific teams. So I would probably credit that as me kicking off a real passion for doing something with football history, at least.
Yeah, you call yourself an old soul. I think that's one thing that many of us at the Sports History Network have in common. I always joke. I always joke that, oh yeah, sure, I love newspapers, opera, and baseball. I'm all set for the 20th century.
That's right. You got to get bootleg liquor.
There you go.
Welcome everyone to the Football Odyssey. This is your host, Aron Harris. Today's guest is Scott
name
Hanson,
of your website, the name of your podcast is The Football Odyssey. What's the concept behind the Football Odyssey?
Going up, I guess, what we were talking about earlier, the more that I got into football history, the more I began to pay attention to football as a narrative. Because I had always looked at sports as I'm not a big sports person outside of football, but the great things about sports is that it's history that's always in the making. So you have plenty of avenues to examine whatever you want through sports, right? I mean, if you want to learn more about labor law, you can look at, the NFL labor battles, for instance, and, the fight for free agency and whatnot. If you want to learn more about, I guess, mathematics or science, you could go deep into the strategy of different formations and passing velocities and everything like that. So I think for me, it's a narrative that expands so deep into American culture, going back to how the game really began and what most people consider the first game in 1869. I would go a little bit later into the 1880s, but just to see how such a sport that began as a really obscure game had kind of grown into being this hyper elaborate sport that had just attracted so many people to play it, so many people to organize companies around it, or create organizations and coaches and marketers and publicity men. It just seems organic and just grew to take on a life of its own. And seeing as the NFL and frankly the NCAA are two of the most profitable organizations in America right now, I think to me, I just saw so many different intertwining factors that got it to that point that I wanted to examine it from every angle and every era.
Yeah, NCAA football is quite profitable scheme. It helps when you have free labor.
Yeah.
That really reduces operating expenses. So kind of triggered me a little bit there because you were talking about how sports is history in the making. It's often instant history. And yet you seem to have this great respect for the game. So let's talk about one of my obsessions. What do you make of this general rush nowadays to be the first to call somebody or something or some game the greatest of all time?
Well, I think we're just emotional creatures. We like to live in the moment. I think oftentimes, too, the people who are doing this are also not significantly older than the audience that's watching. And obviously, we have millions of people, so the age range is going to differ. But I just think a lot of the people who are writing the articles or who are broadcasting or, who are narrating these documentaries that are being made, they're obviously going to lean more towards around their era, I think. So, and it's always going to be tricky to say, what could be the greatest of all time. I mean, if you look at the 1958 championship game, it wasn't a very well played game, but it was something unique for the time. So I think, for people like us, I think maybe we're going to be biased towards the older generation and kind of see through their eyes. But then I can understand why the newer generation likes to say, this Super Bowl is the greatest of all time, even though it really, not the most previous one, but, one in the past 5 years, let's say, even though I don't think maybe it wasn't as memorable as anybody wants to talk about. So I think it's just habitual. I think anybody in the current era wants to kind of over amplify how important a certain game was or a certain play. And I think maybe there is some truth down the road. We can see where it goes, but I think it's just human nature to want to treat everything that they see in the moment live as kind of the the game to end all games.
That's a good point, the age of people, because, I feel like I'm kind of stuck myself. I mean, if you ask me, the best World Series was in 91. The best Super Bowl was in 92. Like this, the best, the GOAT basketball player is Jordan. I don't care what LeBron does, even though he's playing for my Lakers now. You can't convince me. So maybe we do kind of get stuck in that moment when we are young, and only when we're older do we get perspective on these things. And you may be right. That's actually one of the better answers I've heard for that question, Aaron. Thank you very much. How'd you get into podcasting?
Well, originally it started off as a blog in January of 2020. I had written a book review actually for that book I was mentioning earlier, The League by David Harris. And I had submitted to a couple magazines and
not many
didn't
players
get picked
claim
up,
to
so I
be a
just
member of
kind
their
of thought,
team's
what if I just
worst
kind of went my
all-time
own
season
direction
as well as its best.
kind of did things my way.
And have
I
a
could
great
have
time
long
doing
form
both.
articles. I could have
Tackled
really
Chet
obscure
Bulger
topics
of the
that I don't
Chicago
think maybe
Cardinals
anybody else would
enjoyed
be
an
interested
intriguing
about except
9-year
myself.
career in the NFL,
And it was
being
just kind
with
of
the
a way for
Cardinals
me
from
to, I guess, kind of create my own
1942
little
to
universe where I
1949.
could one day talk about the history of free agency, the next day do a book review about Weeb Eubank, then talk about the history of football in Japan, and then go into minor league football teams that have played in Las Vegas. So that was me kind of just exercising my creative juices and trying to create some sort of narrative within football. And then I think 2020 was also the year that I kind of really got into podcasting. I'd always been interested in, some radio shows that I had listened to in podcast forms if I didn't able to listen to it live. But 2020, given everything that happened, there was a lot of time working remotely that you could kind of maybe check out some new stuff. And I just started listening to podcasts, and I kind of thought, maybe could I try doing something like this? So ever since I think I started that in July, and just going through that, it's been a work in progress, but it's been fun. You get to talk to a lot of interesting people, learn a lot of new things, and I guess kind of experiment, see, who likes what you can do more of. So I'm having a good time though. I like to balance it out a little bit more because I've gotten away from the blog, but I definitely need to get back and create a good workflow for each.
Well, all of us sports history geeks here at the Sports History Network are in your camp. We're interested in the stuff you're interested in, Aaron. I can say that. We'll be right back with Aron Harris of the Football Odyssey podcast and website after the 70 seconds of me talking about something else. Hi, I'm Oz Davis of the True the Goats podcast here at the Sports History Network. I'd like to take a minute to tell you about quite possibly the greatest website of all time, newspapers.com. If you're listening to this podcast, or any of them at the Sports History Network, you're probably into sports history. And you probably also know that for learning about anything prior to, say, 1990 online, the typical search engines like are nearly completely useless. But then there's newspapers.com. Newspapers.com gives you access to over 640 million pages worth of news from North America, Britain, Ireland, and more, dating from 1798 to last week. Do up a search for Super Bowl I, the 36th Berlin Olympics, Wayne Gretzky's first game, whatever. Newspapers.com takes you there with historical flavor that search engines like just don't give you. And now, get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. With a paid subscription, you'll also be helping to support the production of this podcast and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Newspapers.com. Way better for searches than you know what I'm talking about. Okay, we're back. This is the Sports History Network Showcase. I'm Oz Davis of Truly the Goats, and I'm back with Aron Harris of the Football Odyssey podcast. Now, I don't think it was your last episode, but on the featured episode that's still running on the Sports History Network website, you interviewed Scott Hanson of the NFL Red Zone. Nice catch, I gotta say, as a fellow podcaster. But I wanted to ask you, were you surprised at anything that came out of that interview?
I was in the beginning of the interview. I typically like to kind of get a sense about a person's history within the game of football, right? Like what drove you to it? How did you get it? And that's not always the case. Sometimes, if it's a author and we have like a solid topic to really dive into, I'll go into that. But Scott, you really gave me a big rundown about his time at Syracuse. And I know he had played at Syracuse, but I didn't know to the extent that it had like such an impact on him. And especially the fact that he said that his drive as a Syracuse football player still sticks with him today. He mentioned that he never really got that shining moment like Rudy did. And he was a long snapper, so I don't really think there were too many opportunities.
You don't get many Rudy moments as the long snapper, that's for sure.
Yeah, but it was cool to hear that side of him, right? Because we got to the red zone questions at the end, but it was interesting to kind of hear the man behind NFL Red Zone to kind of see where is it that he gets his sort of broadcasting style from. And when he was going through his influences, it made a lot of sense because he went through some like local host that had influenced him, which you could see too, because you're not going to find a lot of national guys that may have that same sort of enthusiasm that he has. Because Red Zone is very experimental, so he has a lot of opportunity to be a little flexible, but he does it well. So yeah, I would probably say I was surprised at how much his time at Syracuse had influenced him as a broadcaster and how some of his local influences really captured him as well.
Yeah, it's about a 30-minute interview, and there's a good 13, 14 minutes where he essentially just monologues about Syracuse versus a player and then as a broadcaster in his early days. It's a really nicely done piece for the Football Odyssey podcast. Can you give us a tease of a future episode? What you got coming up?
Yeah, definitely. There's I want to get back to doing some film reviews for the website or for the podcast, and there is a group of movies that I would like to do a review of all in one episode. They have kind of a similar theme, and I think it would make sense to watch these movies as a triple feature. So it's going to be an episode that I want to put out probably by the end of this month. And then I also am trying to schedule some more trivia episodes. Darren Hayes of Pigskin Dispatch was on for a Steelers trivia, and I had a lot of fun doing that. So I would definitely like to start branching out and doing a lot of different teams. I'd like to start doing NFL teams, and then once have someone for that, I'd like to move into college football teams. And then if we go into college football, that'll keep me busy forever because the options are limitless. So
USFL? CFL?
Oh, that's true. Yeah, we could go minor league teams. Yeah, that is true. Yeah. Okay. Well, there we go. Yeah.
I mean, USFL, you could kill a show with that. It's always fun to talk about the USFL. I mean, talk about your
100%.
Yeah, talk about your crazy moments in football history. That's it. Okay, so we talked about on the top of the show about how you're a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, and of course we have the draft coming up. I'm pretty obsessed with the NFL draft myself. So what do you think the Steelers are going to do on draft day? What do you hope they do? And what are your expectations for next season?
I would really like to see a running back, truthfully, and I know it's kind of against the grain in today's game to draft one early, but from what I saw from Najee Harris last year, I really like him. I think he has that sort of power running that Pittsburgh has historically had success with, those kind of runners. I'm not too familiar with the centers that are in this draft, but they're obviously going to need someone to replace Pouncey, and it doesn't look like Villanueva is going to be back, so they're definitely going to need someone, unless they can kind of move some guys around on the roster that they currently have. But for me, the rushing attack is number one, because last year I think the lack of a rushing attack, and there's always multiple factors that go into it, but I think it really limited them later in the season. So truthfully, Najee Harris, I would be happy to see. Travis Etienne too from Clemson, I would take also. As far as expectations go, man, it's always tricky to kind of predict where they can go because there's so much that can happen, but I'd be hard pressed to think they can replicate the season they had this year like they did last year. But you never know. I mean, Claypool is going to be a second-year player now, and for the rookie season that he had, I'm really looking to see what kind of leap he makes. Juju's going to be back, so as long as Juju has someone that can draw double coverage, he can do well, in the slot or against single coverage. Deontay Johnson, I think, is going to hopefully have some a little bit better time holding on to the ball, but he was always a good player last year. He just had trouble catching, and then we'll see where they can go from there. I mean, the defense, I think, is going to have most of the guys back. We'll see if Devin Bush can remain healthy. And come back good from his injury, and TJ obviously is probably the best player aside, or maybe Minka might be the best defensive player on that team. But I can see them pushing for a 10-6 season. I don't think anything beyond that, in my opinion, would be overachieving.
Yeah, I was going to say Claypool and Juju really need one another. The Steelers have a knack for drafting and developing great wide receivers, but they got to keep those guys on the field at the same time. I mean, that's what led to their demise, I think, last season. How much longer do you think Ben is good for?
I think this is last year. I truthfully think Juju kind of signed on for 1 year because I think Ben probably may have told him, hey, I think this is probably going to be my swan song, so might want to stick around for the ride. But yeah, I don't see him making it past it.
Could be a challenging season. Didn't Pittsburgh end last year at number 1? Didn't they win? They won that division?
Yeah, the division, they had Cleveland came to town, defeated them, and Pittsburgh just crushed them. Yeah, I don't expect that to happen again this year. Truthfully, I think if they make the wild card, and which I think they're still going to maintain the 17 wild card, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, if they can make it in at 10-6, I think they'll definitely get a spot in there. But
I was just thinking, because they won the division last year, that means they get the number 1 schedule as well. That means they're going to be playing Buffalo, Kansas City, and Indianapolis,
Tampa Bay,
or Tennessee.
Yeah.
Well, I know in the AFC, I don't know. In the NFC, I don't know what division are they drawing.
I'm trying to think my way backwards. I think in 2018 they played the NFC South.
Right.
Last year it was, and then 2019 was the NFC West.
Oh, great. Well, maybe they'll get the East.
They played the East last year actually, because the first game was against the New York Giants. So the only people they have left is the NFC North. So they play Green Bay and Chicago and.
Well, great. You get Chicago, Detroit, and Minnesota there.
Yeah.
That's 3 wins probably. Well, Aron Harris of the Football Odyssey podcast and website, thanks for joining us today on the Sports History Network Showcase.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Hey, thanks. Keep up the great work. This has been the Sports History Network Showcase podcast. I'd like to thank my guest, Aron Harris of the Football Odyssey website and podcast, the latter of which is available at sportshistorynetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts. The theme song for the SHN Showcase is Quartz by Anitek, and it is available through fair use agreement via freemusicarchive.org. SHN Showcase will be back soon with another Sports History Network podcast. Until then, this is Oz Davis saying stay safe and stay historical. So basically, what are your expectations for next season?
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings your sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorum Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.